In the ashes of Tokyo, where ration books promised food that never came, one American soldier broke orders, put down his rifle, and shared peaches with starving children, changing how an entire city saw the enemy, Tokyo. 1945. The war is finished, but survival is not. Imagine walking down streets where whole neighborhoods have been reduced to blackened holes in the earth. Walls that once held shops and homes are now broken teeth jutting into the sky between them. People move quietly, clutching bags that are nearly empty. They are not searching for victory or even comfort. They are searching for food by the end of the war. The average Japanese civilian was surviving on little more than half the calories needed to live. Rice was rare, barley was stretched thin, and sweet potatoes became the only thing filling stomachs even in Tokyo. The capital of an empire that once dreamed of ruling Asia. Meals were measured not in portions, but in hope. Ration books offered promises, but often delivered nothing. On some streets, notices were posted. No delivery this week. Entire weeks. When the city government simply had nothing to hand out, mothers sent their children on long walks into the countryside, carrying a pot or a bundle of clothing, hoping a farmer would trade vegetables for whatever they could offer. Many came back empty-handed, and in the heart of the city, hungry children learned to watch the tracks of the electric trains because sometimes a soldier or a passing worker dropped a piece of bread. Tokyo had known destruction before, but the silence of hunger was different. People were thin, but their fear was heavy. For years, they had been told that Americans were monsters, that if they ever came, they would kill, humiliate, and destroy everything in their path. Now the war was lost, and those very men in uniform walked the same broken streets to civilians. They were both a threat and a mystery. But the truth was more complicated. Many of those young American soldiers were hardly older than the Japanese boys who had just returned from military schools. They carried rifles and orders. Yes, but also cans of beans, packs of crackers, and chocolate bars tucked into their field kits. To them, these were ordinary supplies. To civilians, they were the difference between hunger and survival. In the first weeks of occupation, official rules kept the soldiers distant. MacArthur's headquarters demanded discipline, order, and no fraternization. The idea was simple: occupation forces were there to control, not to befriend. Smiles were rare, conversations rarer. Yet, reality is rarely so clean. On the ground, a different story began to write itself. A soldier guarding a rail yard saw a boy no older than his little brother back home in Ohio. Barefoot and staring, the soldier had a can of meat and beans in his pack. He could have eaten it later, but instead he pulled it out, opened it with a tin opener, and handed it over. The boy didn't bow, didn't speak, he just stared, then ran home later. Neighbors whispered the enemy had given food. Another soldier standing watch outside a warehouse in Yokohama pulled a small bar of chocolate from his jacket. Army chocolate wasn't sweet or delicate. It was bitter, designed to be practical. But when he gave it to a little girl whose cheeks were hollow from hunger, she held it like treasure. She broke it in half and gave the other piece to her younger brother. For days, the family talked about the American, who gave them a taste of something we thought was gone forever. These were not official relief missions. Those would come later, when American ships unloaded tons of wheat and rice, and when policies were written in offices lined with polished wood. These were moments that existed outside of orders, moments where one human being saw another's need and chose to act, and the shock was profound for families who had been warned that the foreign soldier was the face of cruelty. These small acts shook old beliefs. Could it be that the uniform did not always hide a monster? Could it be that the enemy, who burned their cities, could also share his meal? The war left a destruction on every side, but hunger stripped away barriers. When your stomach twists from emptiness, the man who gives you bread is no longer only an enemy. He is someone who sees your hunger and answers it. This is where our story begins, in the ashes of Tokyo, where food was more precious than money, where fear shaped every thought or sound, and where one unexpected act could change not only a day, but an entire perspective. But while hunger defined the struggle, daily life in those ruins told a story just as powerful, and it's there that we need to go next. If you woke up in Tokyo during the final months of 1945, the first question was not, what do I want to eat, but is there anything at all? The city, once bursting with markets, tea shops, and vendors calling out their wares, now offered only lines, long lines of people clutching ration books that might or might not be honored. The war had ended, but the battle to survive went on every day. The government tried to distribute rice barley and meager portions of vegetables, but shortages crippled the system. Rations promised on paper often never arrived. Families were given tickets, stood for hours, and sometimes left with nothing but disappointment. Rumors spread quickly. There will be soybeans at Ueno Station tomorrow, or rice will come to the ward office at dawn. Mothers and grandparents walked miles just to wait, only to find empty shelves. Hunger was not an event. It was the rhythm of life. Children adapted to this harsh reality. Faster than anyone, they scavenged for scraps, in alleyways looking for peels or discarded fish bones. Schoolyards became barter grounds. One child trading a small sweet potato for another's handful of barley. Teachers themselves, weak with hunger, often dismissed classes early because no one had the strength to sit through the lessons for many children. The war did not end with the emperor's surrender. It lived on. In the sound of their stomachs, the black market thrived in the shadows of this hunger. On back streets in Shinjuku or near the charred ruins of Ginza, makeshift stalls appeared with food stacked in small piles, rice wrapped in cloth, dried fish in baskets. Cans that looked suspiciously foreign. Prices were impossible. For most, a single egg could cost a week's wages. Men sold heirlooms. Women bartered clothing. Children begged. Survival meant sacrifice, and dignity often became a currency. Spent too quickly in rural areas outside Tokyo, life offered more food, but little mercy. Farmers, weary of government seizures during the war, were reluctant to hand over rice to desperate city dwellers. Visitors from Tokyo would arrive with watches, silk kimonos, or even wedding rings, hoping to trade for a few bowls of grain. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they were turned away, and sometimes farmers themselves were short, their fields having been stripped bare by years of war. Demands inside homes. Meals were stripped to their bones. Soup became little more than hot. Water with a leaf or two floating inside. Families stretched barley with ground acorns, making a bitter mix that stuck to the teeth. Children learned not to complain because everyone was starving together. But silence at the dinner table was louder than words. The emotional toll was just as heavy as the physical hunger. Parents felt the shame of not being able to feed their children. Grandparents remembered years when rice was plentiful and now stared at bowls that looked empty. Hunger is more than the absence of food. It eats at dignity, hope, and trust in the future. The war had ended, but it left behind this wound. And through it all, the presence of American soldiers was constant. They patrolled streets, guarded rail stations, and stood watch outside government buildings for many civilians. Their uniforms were reminders of the fire bombings that had gutted the city. Mothers pulled their children close when soldiers passed, afraid of what might happen. Older men turned their faces away, unwilling to look at those who represented defeat. But hunger forced contradictions. People whispered to each other. They have food. Soldiers carried tins of meat, biscuits, powdered milk, even if most followed orders and kept to themselves. The sight of their heavy packs was a daily reminder of what civilians lacked, and the temptation to approach, to ask to risk humiliation or rejection. This temptation grew stronger every day. Small moments began to shift. The silence an American soldier might leave a can half-eaten near a post. A child watching from across the street would dart forward to grab it. A mother might trail behind a group of soldiers, hoping one would glance her way. With pity each time food changed hands, whether intentionally or by accident, it carried meaning. It suggested that survival was not entirely abandoned to fate. For many Japanese families, these encounters were confusing. They had been told the enemy would treat them without mercy, yet here was evidence, small, quiet, but real, that mercy could be shown. It did not erase the destruction of the fire raids or the grief of the lost. But in those moments, hunger made trust grow where no one expected it. Tokyo's ruins were not only made of bricks and ashes, they were made of memories and mistrust, of silence and suspicion. But hunger has a way of breaking walls faster than bombs. And while daily life remained harsh, the stage was being set for moments that no ration card or government decree could have written. But when the Americans themselves stepped into this fragile world, carrying both rifles and rations, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. And that is where our story turns next. The first time most Japanese civilians saw the American occupation forces march through Tokyo. The air seemed to stop. Long lines of trucks rolled in, engines loud against streets where even voices had grown quiet. From hunger and loss, soldiers in khaki uniforms stepped down, rifles slung across their shoulders, boots crunching on the broken pavement for many. Japanese watching from the windows of half-burned houses or the gaps where walls used to be. This was the enemy they had been taught to fear. The surrender had been only weeks before people remembered the radio broadcast of the Emperor's voice, faint and formal, telling them the war was finished. To lose was already unbearable. To be occupied by foreign soldiers felt like humiliation carved into the very ground. Rumors had spread for years that Americans would kill indiscriminately, that they would treat women and children with cruelty, that life under occupation would be worse than death. Now those predictions faced their test. At first, soldiers followed their orders with rigid precision. General Douglas MacArthur had issued strict instructions. No fraternization. Occupation troops were told to maintain distance, to keep professionalism above all else, to act not as friends but as enforcers. The mission was clear: disarm Japan, secure stability, and prevent chaos in a defeated nation. Civilians were to be kept at arm's length, so the first days felt like two parallel worlds sharing the same streets. On one side, Americans with their supply trucks, clean uniforms, and boxes of rations. On the other, civilians in patched clothing, clinging to ration tickets and carrying empty pots, watching carefully but saying nothing. The distance was visible in every intersection. Children stood on corners staring at soldiers as though at strange animals. Mothers pulled them away, whispering, "Don't go near them." Men looked down, unwilling to meet foreign eyes, but soldiers are human. No matter what orders say, and hunger visible in the faces of civilians was impossible to ignore. Many of the GIS were not much older than 20. Some came from farms in Iowa or Kansas, places where harvests had been plentiful even during the war. They had known rationing back home, but nothing like this now in Tokyo. They looked into the hollow faces of children and saw something that crossed all boundaries. One American private later wrote in a letter home, "They looked at us with fear. First, then with hunger. I didn't know which was worse." Another described a group of boys following him down the street, their eyes locked not on his weapon, but on the bulge of his ration pouch. The sight made him uncomfortable, but also guilty. "I couldn't just walk away," he confessed. Still, most soldiers obeyed orders. At first, they kept their distance, standing at posts patrolling the ruins, making sure the defeated city did not erupt in violence. Yet moments began to slip through the cracks of discipline. A guard stationed at a railway crossing saw an old man stumble with a bag of sticks meant for cooking fuel. Instinctively, the soldier reached out to help him lift it. The man hesitated, unsure if this was a trick, but accepted no words passed between them. But the silence itself felt like something had shifted for civilians. The contradictions were overwhelming. How could these same soldiers who had flown planes that burned their neighborhoods now stand calmly, even kindly on their streets? Some resented it deeply, unable to forgive others, felt confusion bordering on disbelief, and for children, the soldiers were not only threatening, they were fascinating. Their height, their strange accents, the smell of tobacco and canned meat that followed them. It was all foreign but also magnetic. A boy in Sumida Ward later recalled sneaking closer to a group of American soldiers just to watch them eat. They had bread, real bread, soft and white. I could smell it from across the street. My stomach hurt so much, I thought I would faint. He never forgot the moment one soldier noticed him, and against regulations tore off a piece to toss his way. This is how the lines began to blur. Each forbidden glance, each small act of kindness, chipped away at the barrier between occupier and civilian. The Americans had been trained to hold themselves apart, but every can of food, every smile, every act of help told a different story. And civilians who had braced themselves for cruelty found themselves confronted with something harder to process. Mercy. None of this meant the occupation was simple or easy. There were still strict curfews, arrests, and harsh punishments for crime or disorder. Hunger persisted, black markets swelled, and fear remained. But alongside these realities, something unexpected took root. An unspoken connection between ordinary soldiers and the people they were supposed to dominate. It wasn't official policy. It wasn't part of any strategy. It was the result of human beings looking at each other across the ruins of war and deciding for a moment to act not as enemies, but as people. But the turning point didn't come with orders or policy. It came with food, quietly shared on the streets when rules gave way to instincts and soldiers began offering what little comfort they could. And that is where our story moves next. It began quietly. A ration can here, a candy bar. There, nothing organized, nothing planned, just moments when a soldier carrying more than he needed saw someone who had nothing at all. And in those small exchanges, the wall between conqueror and conquered started to crack. One story comes from Koga, a town north of Tokyo, where soldiers had been stationed to guard supply depots. They often walked through streets lined with children, who watched them in silence. The soldiers carried their gear and their rations. Heavy tins of meat and beans, small crackers, chocolate bars, meant for energy rather than enjoyment. The children didn't beg. They just looked. That look, part fear, part hunger, was hard to ignore. One afternoon, a young soldier, probably no more than 21, stopped. He pulled a Hershey bar from his pocket, broke it into 3 pieces, and handed it to the nearest children. At first, they didn't move. They had been told Americans were dangerous. But when he smiled and held out his hand, they reached forward later. One of those children recalled, "It was the first time I tasted chocolate in years. I thought it was a dream." Scenes like that began to repeat across cities in Yokohama. A group of school children followed a pair of GIS who were carrying boxes of rations. The soldiers knew the rules don't fraternize, but rules are easy to bend when you're being shadowed by 6 pairs of desperate eyes. One of them whispered to the other, "I can't take it," and reached into his pack. Out came a small tin of condensed milk. He pulled open the top and poured a bit into a chipped cup. The children carried the children passed it between them as if it were liquid gold. They licked the last drop, savoring sweetness they had almost forgotten existed. These weren't grand gestures. They didn't end hunger, but they mattered to the children. It was proof that the enemy could be human to the soldiers. It was a way to ease the guilt. They felt walking through a land their bombs had leveled. Not everyone welcomed it. Some Japanese parents pulled their children back, afraid. Don't take anything, they warned, believing it might be a trap, or fearing gossip that their family was too quick to Trust, the enemy, pride was still strong even when stomachs were empty. Accepting food could feel like accepting defeat. Yet hunger has a way of breaking pride down. And when a soldier offered something without demand, many found it impossible to refuse soldiers, two-faced conflict. They knew they could be disciplined for fraternizing letters from the time. Reveal the strain one GI wrote home, we're told not to mix with them. But how do you look at a kid who hasn't eaten and just walk away? Another admitted that sharing his rations wasn't just for the civilians, it was for himself. I couldn't eat in front of them, not without giving something. And there were times when generosity created misunderstandings. A soldier in Shibuya once gave a can of Spam to a woman. Waiting by a ration line, she took it with both hands but began to cry. He thought he had offended her. Later, learned that the tears came because it was the first meat she had held since before the firebombs. Food is never just food in those moments. A chocolate bar became a bridge, a tin of peaches became a symbol. A cracker broken in half carried more weight than any speech or policy. They were gestures that whispered, the war is over. At least between us, right here in this moment. Children remembered these moments for decades. Many who grew old told their grandchildren stories of the first taste of American chocolate. The sweetness melting on their tongues while ruins still smoked in the distance. They did not remember the soldier's name, but they remembered the act. These were not isolated miracles. They were repeated in Sumida, in Koga, in Yokohama, in the shadows of burned-out schools and along ration lines that never delivered, each one a thread in a fragile fabric being stitched back together by people who had every reason to hate each other, and yet found themselves reaching out. The occupation was still strict. Soldiers still carried rifles. Civilians still lived under rules written by the conquerors, but between orders and reality, between hunger and survival, these exchanges carved out a human space that no command could fully control. But it wasn't until one afternoon in Tokyo's Sumida ward, outside the ruins of a bombed-out school, that this fragile bond was captured in its purest form. When one soldier placed his rifle aside and shared his meal with two hungry children. The story that people still recall, the one that carried through neighborhoods and became almost like a legend, happened in Tokyo's Sumida ward. In late 1945, the war had ended just weeks before. Yet the scars of fire bombings were still raw. Whole blocks of wooden houses had been flattened by incendiary raids, leaving only blackened earth and twisted beams. A school once filled with the voices of children now stood gutted. Its windows shattered, its roof half collapsed. It was in front of this broken school that something unforgettable unfolded. A U.S. private barely older than 20 had been stationed as a guard. His orders were simple: stand post, keep watch, ensure no disorder. He stood with his rifle slung at his side, his helmet tilted forward to block the late autumn glare behind him. The skeleton of the school loomed, a reminder of war's brutality around him. The neighborhood struggled on people lining up at a nearby ration point. Though most suspected the food wouldn't come among the crowd, were two siblings, a boy of about 8 and his younger sister, maybe 6. They stood quietly at the edge of the line, holding hands while their mother waited further ahead, clutching a ration book. Like it was life itself, the children weren't crying, nor did they beg. They simply stared, thin and silent, their eyes fixed on the soldier. The private noticed them. At first, he did what he had been trained to do. He looked away. Fraternization was forbidden. He was here to guard, not to engage. But the longer he stood, the harder it was to ignore those eyes. They reminded him of his little cousins back home in Pennsylvania. Kids who had never missed a meal, who ran across fields with laughter instead of standing barefoot in rubble. Finally, he shifted his rifle and leaned it against the wall. He crouched down, opening the small kit strapped to his belt. The children watched cautiously, uncertain whether to run or stay. Slowly, he pulled out a tin can. The label, faded but clear enough, read peaches to the children. It was a word they hadn't spoken in years. He reached for his opener, punctured the metal with a sharp pop and peeled it back. The golden syrup glistened in the sunlight. The boy's eyes widened. The girl clutched his arm tightly. The soldier took out a spoon, scooped one half of a peach, and held it forward. The children hesitated. Their mother, noticing from the line, began to move toward them, torn between fear and desperation. But the soldier simply smiled and gestured gently. The boy stepped forward, took the spoon, and tasted sweetness, burst onto his tongue for a moment. The ruins around him vanished. The soldier then handed them a packet of crackers, hard and plain, yet in that moment more precious than gold. Finally, he broke off a piece of army-issue chocolate, a bar infamous among GIs for its bitterness. To the children, it was treasure. They broke it in half and shared it, chewing slowly, as if afraid the taste might disappear. Their mother arrived. Breathless, she bowed deeply, words failing her. The private nodded slightly. Though he knew he was breaking orders, there was no common language. But in that instant, no words were needed. Food had spoken for him. Neighbors watching from nearby could hardly believe what they had seen. Whispers spread quickly. An American had given food to Japanese children. Not just scraps left behind, but real rations willingly shared to families who had been told for years that Americans were devils. This moment landed like a shockwave. Later, the boy would tell friends, "I tasted peaches for the first time since the war began." His sister recalled how the soldier's face softened as he handed her the chocolate for them. It was not just a meal, it was a memory of kindness carved into a landscape of destruction for the private. It was a moment of quiet rebellion against orders that demanded distance. In his diary, found decades later, he wrote, "I couldn't stand there and watch them starve. Maybe I'll be reprimanded, maybe worse, but those kids looked like my family. What else could I do?" This exchange didn't change the larger reality. Hunger still haunted the streets. Ration lines still often failed. The black market still ruled. But for one family and for those who heard the story, it altered how they saw the men in uniform. The enemy was no longer a faceless destroyer. He was a young man who had placed his rifle aside and offered food with his own hands. Acts like these did not erase war's pain, but they created cracks in the wall of hatred. Through those cracks, something new began to grow. The idea that humanity can survive even when everything else is burned away. But what happened in Sumida Ward was not an isolated act. It began to echo through the city, reshaping how civilians and soldiers saw each other, and those ripples are what we need to look at. Next, word spread fast, and the city starved, not just for food, but for hope. The story of the American private who gave peaches and chocolate to children in Sumida Ward traveled from street to street. Like an underground current, neighbors whispered it outside the ration office. Mothers repeated it as they cooked thin soup over charcoal fires. Children told it to their friends at school, their eyes widening as they described the golden syrup of canned fruit and the sweetness of chocolate melting on their tongues. For some, the story sounded unbelievable. How could the same Americans who had burned Tokyo with firebombs now give food to children? It didn't fit the picture people had carried through years of propaganda and fear. Yet the story was too consistent, retold by too many witnesses to dismiss as fantasy. Something was shifting in the weeks that followed. More moments like it surfaced. A soldier in Yokohama quietly handed an old man a pack of crackers when he saw him stumbling outside a ration line. Another station near Shinjuku left a tin of Spam on a doorstep, where he often saw a mother and child waiting with empty bowls. A GI in Ueno gave a half-empty canteen of milk to a young boy and watched him run home to share it with his baby sister. These were not official relief efforts. They didn't replace the shipments of wheat and rice that began arriving months later under government programs, but they carried an emotional weight. Those official deliveries could not. Official food aid came from faceless offices, from ships and storage depots, from policies debated in Washington and MacArthur's headquarters. A single can of peaches, handed from one pair of hands to another, was different. It was immediate, personal, undeniable. Civilians began to talk about the soldiers differently instead of the enemy. They began to call them the Americans. The word softened where once mothers had warned their children to avoid soldiers. Some now whispered, "If they give you something, take it." For people who had been told Americans were devils, the idea that they could be kind was disorienting, but also strangely comforting. Of course, not everyone was ready to accept it. Pride still ran deep, especially among older generations who had lost sons to the war. For them, kindness from an occupier felt like salt in the wound. A retired shopkeeper in Asakusa muttered that the Americans were only trying to buy loyalty. "They burn our houses, then hand us candy." He spat, yet even he could not stop his grandson from sneaking towards soldiers in the hope of another sweet. The Americans themselves were changed by these interactions. Many of them admitted privately that they had expected hostility, even violence from civilians. Instead, they saw silence, exhaustion, and hunger. It made their own sense of victory feel hollow. Sharing food became a way of easing the guilt they carried, guilt for the bombings, for the destruction, for the look of emptiness in the eyes of people they were told were once enemies. Letters home reveal this quiet transformation. A soldier wrote to his mother in Ohio, "I gave my rations to a little girl today. She smiled at me. It's the first time I've seen a smile here for a second. I forgot we were supposed to be enemies." Another confessed, "When I hand them food, I feel like I'm feeding my own kids." Maybe this is how peace starts. Not with treaties, but with crackers and milk. The ripples didn't stop at the emotional level. They slowly reshaped the atmosphere of occupation itself. Civilians who once walked past soldiers with their heads lowered began to lift their eyes. Children who once ran away now hovered nearby, waiting to see if a hand might reach into a pack. Even the smallest gestures built a fragile bridge of trust. Boss never used. 785CA2F808 on a massive scale. It was these personal exchanges that softened the edge of occupation policies, could restore calories, but kindness restored dignity. When a hungry child received food directly from the hands of a soldier, the war between them ended for that moment. The story of Sumida Ward became symbolic of this shift. Families retold it not just because of the food, but because of what it represented. That even in the ruins of war, humanity could break through, and when stories like that take hold, they carry power. They turn suspicion into curiosity, fear into gratitude, and hatred into something that looks, however faintly, like trust. None of this erased the devastation. Tokyo was still a city of ashes. Hunger still gnawed daily. Families still mourned the dead. Yet alongside grief and scarcity, these ripples of kindness began to change how people remembered the early days of occupation. They didn't remember just the soldiers with rifles. They remembered the ones who handed out peaches, crackers, and chocolate. But as time passed, those gestures became more than anecdotes. They became lessons, reminders that even in the darkest aftermath of war, small acts of humanity can light a way forward, and that's where our story must end in reflection. Looking back on Tokyo in late 1945, it is tempting to see only ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, families scraping for food, children learning to grow up with empty stomachs. Yet when we peel away the smoke and rubble, what remains most visible are the stories of survival and the unexpected gestures that kept hope alive. The war had ended in unconditional surrender, but peace had not yet taken root. Trust had to be built slowly, and it began in places few imagined, on sidewalks outside ration lines, and in the small space between a soldier's hand and a child's outstretched palm. The private who gave peaches and chocolate in Sumida Ward could not have known that his act would echo far beyond that single afternoon for him. It was instinct, a refusal to watch two children suffer while he had the means to help. Yet the effect rippled outward, reshaping the way neighbors talked, the way families thought about the Americans, the way children remembered their first taste of sweetness after years of deprivation. It was proof that even when governments draw sharp lines, ordinary people can cross them. What makes this story so powerful is its ordinariness. The soldier was not a general making grand decisions, nor was the family a symbol carefully chosen for propaganda. They were simply people caught in the aftermath of destruction, responding to hunger with kindness. And because it was ordinary, it was believable, relatable, unforgettable. These are the moments that endure, the ones that show history is not only made in conferences and treaties, but also in gestures of compassion. To understand the weight of these small acts, we need to remember the depth of mistrust that existed. Japanese civilians had been told for years that Americans would be brutal, merciless, inhuman. American soldiers, in turn, had been hardened by propaganda of their own, taught to see Japanese civilians as complicit. In the war that had cost so many of their friends' lives, the distance between them was measured not just in language, but in pain, fear, and prejudice. And yet, when hunger cut through that distance, kindness bridged the gap. There is a lesson here that stretches beyond Tokyo. Beyond 1945, it is that war may divide nations, but acts of humanity reconnect them. When a soldier sets aside his rifle to open a can of peaches, when a child learns that kindness can come even from a former enemy, something larger than food is exchanged. It is dignity, it is recognition. It is the first fragile step toward reconciliation. Many of the children who received food from American soldiers carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Decades later, when interviewed, they spoke not of occupation as pure humiliation, but of the moments that gave them comfort. Some said they never forgot the first taste of chocolate, not because of the flavor, but because of what it represented, that the world could be kinder than they had been. LED to believe others remembered the way soldiers smiled as they handed out crackers, as if to say, without words, you matter for the soldiers too. These moments mattered in their letters and diaries. They described the guilt of walking through ruins, the shame of having food while others starved, and the relief that came when they could share. These acts did not erase the destruction they had been part of, but they allowed them to reclaim a piece of their own humanity in a place defined by devastation. So what does this teach us today? It teaches us that the smallest decisions, a shared meal, a piece of bread broken into, can carry consequences far beyond what we imagine. In the vastness of war and its aftermath, individual gestures might seem insignificant, but they can redefine relationships, soften hatred, and open a path to healing. The story of Sumida Ward is not just about Tokyo in 1945. It is about the human capacity to see beyond labels of enemy and victor, to recognize the simple truth that hunger, sorrow, and hope are shared conditions. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by destruction, but also a compassion in the ruins. As we close this story, let it linger, not as a tale of occupation, but as a lesson in humanity. Even in the worst of times, a choice exists to turn away or to extend a hand. That choice, repeated across generations, determines whether our history is only one of conflict or also of kindness. If you take anything from this, let it be this: never underestimate the power of a small act of generosity. It can outlast fear, cross barriers, and even rewrite the way people remember war itself. And if you found value in this story, subscribe for more, because history is filled not just with battles and treaties, But with human stories like this, stories that remind us that compassion, even in the smallest forms, has the power to change everything.